me fait plaisir d'accueillir Dave Chalmers de l'université NYU. Il est professeur à l'université de New York, professeur de philosophie en sciences neuronales et co-directeur du Center for Mind, Brain and Consciousness à l'université de New York. Il a écrit The Conscious Mind, Constructing the World and Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. Il est connu pour avoir formulé le soi-disant problème difficile de la conscience. Et ensuite, avant ça, il avait proposé avec Andy Clark qu'il y a une sorte d'esprit étendu selon lequel les outils que nous utilisons peuvent devenir des parties, des composantes de notre esprit. Il va peut-être en parler un peu. Ça rejoint un petit peu le thème de ChatGPT et les LLM. So I'm happy to welcome Dave Chalmers from NYU, professor of philosophy and neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain and Consciousness. I won't say any more by way of introduction. I'll simply pass it to you, Dave. Could you share your screen? Or, okay, you can show your face until you share your screen. It's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be here talking to this group today. I've got many fond memories of lengthy arguments with Stephen about symbol grounding, computation, AI, way back in the early 1990s when I was a graduate student, and it's just terrific to see how these issues are still alive and more important than ever today. I'm going to present a philosophical perspective on some issues about grounding. I've only given this. I gave this talk once before at the American Philosophical Association, which was actually in Montreal in January, where it was my presidential address. This is a little oriented towards philosophy, but I think the issues here are timeless, and just as they're alive in the history of philosophy, they're alive in current philosophy, they're alive in cognitive science, and interesting to get some of that perspective. So yeah, the topic is does thinking require sensory grounding, from the history of philosophy to AI. Just to get us started, here are a few quotes from the history of philosophy. All of these by thinkers in a broadly empiricist tradition about the relationship between thinking and sensing. We have Aristotle. We have the soul never thinks without an image or without a phantasm. Some kind of sensory imagery for Aristotle is central to thinking. Aquinas has this famous line: "There's nothing in the intellect that wasn't previously in the senses." You basically have to go through the senses to get into to be thought at all, and all thinking somehow derives from the senses. Later on, we've got David Hume saying all of our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions. So here, ideas are, roughly speaking, concepts at the level of thinking, whereas impressions are more like sensory experiences. And he says, all of our concepts, all of our thinking is in some way derived from sensory impressions. So these are all theses that tend to suggest that there's no thinking without sensing, or at least sensory capacities, and maybe suggestive of some kind of grounding thesis. At the same time, we've got thinkers in the rationalist tradition who tend to deny that thought requires sensory grounding. Perhaps the two most famous rationalists are Plato and Descartes. Plato certainly held that we have thought. We've got all kinds of thought that precedes having senses, having a body. Even before birth, he thinks we have thought about the forms, which for Plato was the purest form of thought. Before we have senses and a body. Descartes held that we're unities of a physical body and a non-physical mind, but he held that, that the pure intellect thinking is very much the domain of the mind. The pure intellect thinks independently of the senses. Then there's Immanuel Kant, of course, who tried to synthesize or navigate between the empiricist and rationalist traditions. He does say things that are at least suggestive of a grounding thesis, like thoughts without contents are blind, thoughts without sensory contents are blind, although, at the end of the day, his views on all these things are extremely complicated, and it's hard to assign him to one camp or the other. So these issues are a pretty big deal in the history of philosophy. And of course, these days, a very big deal in cognitive science and AI. There's this famous issue that Stephen has dubbed the issue of symbol grounding, which is, I guess, it arises, in the first instance in the context of thinking about symbolic systems in cognitive science, especially symbolic AI systems, where Stephen says to be grounded, which in context is clear that to be grounded is needed to have genuine thought, meaning, and understanding. A symbol system would have to be augmented with non-symbolic sensory motor capacities, the capacity to interact autonomously with the world of objects, events, actions, properties, and states. So the key thesis here for us is that, thought, meaning, capacities such as thought, meaning, and understanding, sensory motor capacities are crucial for the capacities for thought, meaning, and understanding. And, this was 1990, but now in the 2020s, this thesis is very much alive and central. We've got all kinds of people in the current AI scene who are proponents of a grounding requirement on cognition, and argue that current AI systems, especially large language models, lack adequate grounding and therefore may lack capacities for thinking, meaning, and understanding. There's this famous statement by Emily Bender and Alexander Koller in their paper on climbing towards natural language understanding, meaning, form, and understanding in the age of data. That was the one where they put forward the octopus thought experiment as a relevantly ungrounded system. There's a paper on stochastic parrots. My colleagues at NYU, Brendan Lake and Gregory Murphy, have a paper from the perspective of psychology and psycholinguistics on word meaning, arguing for a grounding requirement, not adequately satisfied by current systems. And even Jan LeCun and the philosopher Jake Browning have argued that current language models lack the kind of grounding, of sensory grounding, that would be required for full-scale thinking, meaning, and understanding. As they put it, there are limits. Current language models are very much based in language, and there are limits to a fully language-based system because they lack sensory grounding. And there's kind of an argument behind all this in the current debate that I want to focus on. This is no doubt oversimplified in many respects, but I think it's a way of at least focusing on some underlying philosophical issues here. Just to say the question is, can large language models think? I mean, I think pretty much exactly the same applies to the issue of understanding language, understanding in general, of meaning things with your language. But I'll start with thinking. I mean, it seems pretty plausible. If you don't think, you also don't understand, and you don't mean. So premise one: language models lack sensory capacities. At least the current paradigmatic language models, the standard GPT systems, which process only text inputs and outputs, they lack sensory capacities. Premise two: genuine thought and meaning and understanding requires sensory capacities. Conclusion: language models lack genuine thought and likewise genuine meaning, genuine understanding. I don't know if anyone's put it in quite such stark terms, but this is at least a oversimplified argument to get our that we can focus on. Of course, the moment you mount an argument like this, there's any number of responses. You might want to, some people might want to focus on the first premise and say, actually, well, language models have a kind of sensory capacities in that they at least have inputs and outputs. They have text inputs and text outputs, which, depending on what you count as a sense, something we'll get to in a moment, might count as a kind of sensory grounding, although certainly a very non-standard kind, and many people might not want to count that as sensory grounding. But one approach, if you're really focused on causal connections to the environment, say, is to focus on the text inputs and outputs as a potential kind of grounding. Also worth mentioning, of course, there are extended language models, multimodal models, like vision, language, action models, that have something that looks at least a lot closer to sensory grounding, with visual processing and control of a body, virtual or otherwise, that some might count as sensory grounding. Here's a standard vision, language, action model. This is Google's SÉCAN. But the issue I really want to focus on is the second premise, the issue that thinking requires sensory capacities and likewise meaning, likewise understanding. To think about, I think at the very least, to think about this underlying issue, it's useful to think about the capacities of pure AI systems without grounding. Think about the more general issue of whether thought requires sensory processing and why. And that's going to be the issue I concentrate on here. Does thinking require sensory capacities? Oops. So the plan is, I'm going to really focus on this issue, whether thought and understanding require sensory motor capacities. This won't be a direct positive argument that language models can think and understand. I'm not trying here to mount a full-scale analysis of the issue of whether language models can think or understand. There's any number of potential objections to that thesis that I'm not going to be talking about here. One of those is the issue of whether language models are conscious, which I've discussed in some other work that I think was circulated. I'm just here looking at one particular objection to the thesis that language models can think and understand, the issue that they lack sensory capacities, or they lack the right kind of sensory capacities that are required for thinking and understanding. This won't, if I'm right, this won't establish they can think or understand, but it does suggest at least that their lack of sensory, but if I'm right in arguing that thinking doesn't require sensing, that does suggest that their lack of sensory capacities is not a decisive obstacle. Okay, so I'm going to focus on something I'll call the sense-thought thesis. That thought or thinking requires sensory capacities or senses. There are some tricky issues about exactly how this should be phrased. We want to say that thought at a time requires sensory capacities at that time. I mean, there are various reasons why you might not want to say that. Maybe someone has sensory capacities early on, which enables them to think, and then later on they lose the sensory capacities, as when someone becomes blind or deaf. Very plausible they could still retain the ability to think, grounded in their earlier sensory capacities. Furthermore, the statements by people like Aquinas and Hume suggested that to get into the mind, you've got to go through the senses, but it doesn't require that to stay in the mind. You have to stay in the senses. So the way I put the thesis here is that thought requires having had senses, or necessarily, if X thinks at T, X has had the capacity to sense at or before T. There are different ways you might try and put this, but that will do as a simple statement. I mean, there's immediately any number of questions arise in interpreting this thesis. One question is whether this is what is the scope of this thesis? Should it be restricted to humans, or should it be unrestricted? And actually, you get very different dialectics depending on the restriction. You might think, okay, a lot of the time, for the purposes, say, of psychology, we might care about humans. It's arguable that when you look at the debate about these issues between people like Aquinas and Hume and people like Descartes, their focus was actually on humans. I mean, interestingly, it looks like when it comes to non-humans, even people like Aquinas were much less willing to endorse the sense-thought thesis. For example, they held that angels could think without senses, even though maybe humans require senses. In any case, for our purpose, obviously we're concerned with AI systems like language models, which are precisely not human systems. So the human thesis is not the relevant one for our purpose. The relevant one is the unrestricted thesis for any possible being, if you think that requires that you have senses. Maybe human psychology is constrained in certain ways, so that everything in practice has to go through the senses. But here we're concerned with the thesis about beings much broader than just humans, in order that it apply to AI systems. Okay, what are senses and sensory capacities? I mean, this is to some extent a verbal issue, to some extent a substantive issue, depending on what you think is important. There's a long literature on what counts as a sense, and even different proponents of sensory grounding theses might put focus on different aspects of what matters for a sense. I mean, most basically, you might think a sensory capacity is just an input capacity for getting input from the environment with no other restrictions. Then you'll just, maybe, for example, if you're an externalist grounding theorist who thinks what matters for thought is having some causal connection to the environment, then this will be what matters. So on that reading, it's sensory inputs that matter. On other readings, to be a sense requires further constraints over and above just being an input. Maybe, for example, involving a distinctive kind of sensory representation, iconic representation, or analog representation of the kind you find, for example, in maps and plausibly in vision and other senses. Some people might put the focus on the relevant kind of conscious experience, a rich sensory conscious experience, and might put the focus on that. Some grounding theorists who put stress on consciousness might focus on this part. Those who put stress on the analog or iconic nature of what's required for grounding might put focus on the representation part. There's also the whole question of motor action. Stephen puts this thesis in terms of sensory motor capacities. I mean, I'd say motor capacities they're not exactly sensory capacities, but they're almost always very, very tightly bound up with sensory capacities. So if you have motor capacities, you have sensory capacities. In any case, everything I say here about sensory capacities will apply to sensory motor capacities more broadly. Okay, so that's sensing. Thinking, there's lots of different varieties of thinking, but reasoning, judging, is desiring, does this count? There's practical reasoning, but I'll take it that at the very least, minimally thinking involves judgment, the ability to judge that something is the case. I judge that it's raining outside now. I can perceive something, and on that basis judge that it's raining outside now. I can judge that 2 + 2 is 4. That'll be the paradigm case of thinking. Okay, so there's various ways you might want to approach this issue of whether thinking requires sensing and sensory capacities. But I've always been, as a philosopher, I've always been a fan of the key thought experiment as a method, not always decisive, but always usually a very good way to focus the issues. So for me, the natural way to proceed is to think about, especially if we're thinking about the unrestricted thesis, as opposed to the human thesis, is to engage in a thought experiment about a being who has thought without sensory capacities. This is what I would call a pure thinker. Could there be a being who can think while having no sensory capacities at all? If there can be, that strongly suggests that the sense thought thesis is false. Now, this is actually a thought experiment. Versions of this thought experiment can be found in the history of philosophy. And perhaps the most famous and the most telling is a thought experiment known as the floating man or the flying man, put forward by the Islamic philosopher Avicenna back in the 11th century, also known as Ibn Sina. And this was here is a depiction of the floating man from a wonderful book of illustrations of philosophical thought experiments by Helen de Cruz that came out recently. Here is Avicenna's description of the floating man from his Psychology de Anima, around 1027. He says, the floating man was just created at a stroke, fully developed and perfectly formed, but with his vision shrouded from perceiving all external objects. Created floating in the air or in space, not buffeted by any perceptible current of the air that supports him, his limbs separated and kept out of contact with one another so they don't feel each other. So it's, the floating man is all set up so he doesn't feel anything, no sensory experiences, no vision, no hearing, no touch. Then let the subject consider whether he would affirm the existence of his self. And then Avicenna says, there's no doubt that he would affirm his own existence, although not affirming the reality of any of his limbs or any external thing. So Avicenna is making the case that, that the flying man or floating man can at least judge that he exists, affirms the existence of his self, despite not having any knowledge of his body, any sensory experiences whatsoever, which at least seems relevant for our purposes. Avicenna himself is most interested in a metaphysical conclusion. This argument is very reminiscent of Descartes' argument that the self is distinct from the body. Of course, Avicenna got there 6 centuries earlier. He wants to argue the floating man is aware of the self, but not aware of the body, so the self is distinct from the body. And we could argue about that metaphysical conclusion, just as we do in the case of Descartes. But many others following Avicenna used this to draw psychological conclusions about cognitive capacities and their relations. For example, Matthew of Aquasparta, some decades after Avicenna, said the floating man suggests that self-consciousness does not require sensory knowledge. You can have self-consciousness with no sensory experiences whatsoever, and that's closer to what we're after here. So yeah, you might want to use floating. So we could use the floating man, if a coherent thought experiment, to make the case that it seems like the floating man can think at least about himself, even in the absence of any sensory experiences. Now, there are some imperfections in the floating man case for our purposes. I mean, for a start, the floating man, as the name suggests, it's a human and a man, which is very, very restrictive, especially for our purposes when we want to count AI. More substantively, the floating man, as described, does actually have sensory capacities. As described, it seems like the floating man has the capacity to see, to touch, and so on. It's just that his body is very carefully arranged, so he's not using those capacities at a given time. If you think that sensory capacities are what's central to grounding, the floating man still has those. You might try and generalize the argument a bit further by saying, well, yeah, capacities you're using that you've never used can't can't play any big role in grounding, and thereby extend the floating man case. But anyway, for my purpose, floating man is at least not a general enough label. We need a more generic label for a thinker without any sensory capacities, and I'll use the pure thinker label for that purpose. But floating man is at least very, very suggestive. So then the questions are, is a pure thinker actually possible? And if a pure thinker is possible, what could a pure thinker think? So a pure thinker is a being that can think thoughts without any sensory capacities whatsoever. There's a whole lot to be said about this, but prima facie, it seems that pure thinkers certainly seem possible. There have actually been science fiction novels written about AI systems that are basically pure thinkers. One of those is Robert Sawyer's novel Wake, that starts with a description of a AI system gradually waking up. To make it easy, I mean, there are a lot of hard cases for pure thinkers, but to make it easy, we could start with Avicenna's case of a being just thinking about itself. Let's say maybe it's a being that executes Descartes' cogito. I think, therefore I am. Could a being without any senses execute Descartes' cogito? Avicenna would certainly have said yes. It's got awareness of itself. It says, here I am. I'm thinking, therefore I exist. We could also do this for arithmetic, thinking, say, that 2 + 2 is 4. Prima facie, it seems at least straightforwardly conceivable that there could be a pure thinker who thinks 2 + 2 is 4, or who thinks, I think, therefore I am. The claim here is not necessarily that a human could do this. At least in humans, sensory capacities are so central to our existence and all of our capacities, it seems very plausible that if there were a being without any sensory capacities, they would not be able to think. I mean, people sometimes bring up deafblind people like Helen Keller and so on at this point, but obviously Helen Keller and other deafblind people have many sensory capacities. They just don't have vision or hearing in the strong cases. I don't know if there are any cases of humans who have never had any sensory capacities, but if so, it seems, given everything we know about biology and the brain, it seems very likely such a being would have no cognitive capacities. But the issue is not what's possible for humans. After all, we're primarily here interested in AI systems that are not subject to all of these constraints on human development. At the very least, we say there's no obvious contradiction in conceiving of an AI system without senses or even a disembodied mind. And there are these novels that start with AI systems reasoning about their own existence and trying to move on from there. You might say, okay, well, that's just what's conceivable and what seems possible. Maybe there's something scientific we know about the nature of thought that suggests that not just in humans, but in general, all thought requires sensory capacities. There's various ways you could try to defeat this argument for the possibility of pure thinkers. One is to appeal to strong empiricism, the thesis that basically all concepts involve a sensory component. That's the kind of thesis put forward by people like Larry Barsalou and Jesse Prince. Coming more straightforwardly from philosophy, there's various externalist theses that hold that many concepts at least, turn on certain causal relations to the environment. Hilary Putnam's case of water is perhaps the most famous one. To have the concept water, you've got to be connected to H2O. Maybe strong externalism will say that all thought requires connections to an environment that pure thinkers won't have. You can get You can also get versions of this thesis by a very strong version of the extended mind thesis. I mean, I like the extended mind thesis that at least some thought turns on things one is coupled to in the environment. The strong thesis would say that all thought turns on that. There's a corresponding thesis about embodiment. All thought turns on constitution by the biological body. There's strong inactive theses. All thought is constituted by action. In each of these cases, what I want to say is the weak version, maybe a version that says what's plausible in each of these cases is that some thought is constituted by sensory concepts or environmental relations or extended processes and so on, but not that all thought is. Maybe that much human thought involves these things, but for the stronger thesis that all possible thought requires these things, like in general, it's just not terribly plausible. I mean, in the case of strong empiricism, there's a very lively empirical debate going on, even about the human case, about the role of sensory capacities in concept possession, where people like Hume, Vassilou, Prince have argued that all concepts, including mathematical concepts, are so constituted. I think my sense is these days that view, it's out there, but it's fairly widely rejected, and especially in cases like the mathematical case, the view that sensory capacities, a being could not even have arithmetical concepts without sensory capacities, is generally regarded as implausible. In the history of philosophy, as we've seen, even empiricists like Aristotle and Aquinas and Reid reject the view for non-humans. Maybe humans have to go through the senses, but angels, for example, don't. Presumably, they'd say the same for AI systems. And I take it that the leading accounts of logical and mathematical concepts, even in humans these days, are non-empiricist. Externalism raises interesting issues. I mean, quite a lot of symbol grounding theorists I find in practice are externalists. So basically saying to have really genuine meaning or content to your thought, all this has to be anchored in something outside of yourself. Not necessarily crucial that it's sensory, but it's got to be anchored in something external. Standard externalists, I think, the standard externalist arguments hold that some concepts or thought are externally grounded. And there are these classic cases like Putnam's case of water, where if you have H2O in your environment, you get to have the concept water. If you don't have H2O in your environment, you have XYZ, then it's you have some other concept, maybe the concept of twin water. So strong externalism says that all concepts and all thoughts are grounded. If you're a strong externalist, that would tend to suggest a pure thinker is impossible, because a pure thinker's thoughts are not externally grounded, or at least not without a lot of fancy footwork. The problem is the strong thesis needs the strong view. Weak externalism, this says merely some concepts or thoughts are externally grounded, is not going to rule out pure thinkers. So the sense thought thesis requires pure thinkers are impossible, requires that all concepts and thoughts, not even not just in humans, but all possible humans and thoughts, concepts and thoughts are externally grounded. I just don't think any standard externalist arguments come close to establishing that. In fact, it's the standard view, I think, of, say, the mathematical case is that mathematical thoughts about numbers, 2, 4, addition, even in humans, do not turn on external grounding, but rather are internally constituted by something like the psychological role of these concepts. So standard arguments for externalism only support the weak view, not the strong view. In standard externalism, it seems very much consistent with the idea that a being could think about mathematics or about itself without environmental connections. And you can go on to all the other theses. I won't go through the extended mind thesis, the embodiment thesis, the inactive theses, but I think something similar is plausible in all these cases. Yeah, maybe some weak version of these theses is plausible, but not the strong version that all thought turns on this. So I'd be inclined to say at least prima facie, pure thinkers, for example, in AI systems are possible, maybe even secunda facie, in that, looking at possible objections, they still appear to be possible. None of this is decisive, and this is, of course, extremely quick, but this is just getting some of the territory onto the table. Somebody, has of course, there are some very serious and lengthy defenses of strong theses about embodiment and action and externalism out there. Here, I'm not taking on all of those, but I think at least on first appearances, pretty strong reason to think pure thinkers are possible, so that thinking does not require sensing, at least in every possible case. Okay, once we've got that pure thinkers are possible, the next question is, what can a pure thinker think? I mean, everything I've said so far is consistent with there being certain, they can think, but there are certain strong restrictions on what they can think. So I like the tongue twister version of this question. What sort of thing could a pure thinker think if a pure thinker things? Just so we've established that there could be a pure thinker that can think things. What sort of thing could a pure thinker think? So far, we got to, we pretty well had the arithmetical case and the case of the cogito case. And maybe that, is strongly suggestive that a pure thinker could at least possess concepts from logic, like the concept of conjunction or existence, that don't seem to have any obvious requirement of sensory capacities and environmental connections. Mathematics, concepts like plus or two, concepts of thought itself, like the concept of thinking or believing, and indeed the concept of oneself, I. So it looks like a pure thinker could at least think concepts, think thoughts made up of that basic set of concepts. But I think, it could plausibly go a lot further than this. I think you can make a pretty strong case that a pure thinker could possess concepts of time, despite having no sensory connection to the world around it. Could have some internal judgments about time, concepts like what's happening now. Maybe some metaphysical concepts like parts and wholes, one thing being part of another thing. Causal and nomic concepts like the concept of causation or of law or probability. You can make the case don't turn on connections to the environment. Semantic concepts like truth and reference. And these are cases that I've really talked about at length in a whole bunch of earlier work on internalism, externalism concepts. In my book, Constructing the World, I went through a whole bunch of different conceptual domains to think about which are ones for which which concepts are an internalist account the most plausible, and for which ones are an externalist account. But I'd argue for an internalist account for most of these concepts. You could have the concept of temporal concepts like being before, or metaphysical concepts like part or whole, without requiring without involving sensory grounding. You could extend this to say, could a pure thinker just think about itself, or could it entertain thoughts about the world? I think it's very plausible. A pure thinker could actually entertain thoughts about the world, like there exists someone or something distinct from me. There exists a thinker distinct from me. A pure thinker could at least entertain the thought, does there exist a being who's not me? Or there is something that causes this thought. They could, introspect their own thoughts and say, oh, here's what I'm thinking now. There's something that causes that. They could even do some quasi-science, formulating at least scientific hypotheses, like there exist certain quantities, Q, R, and S, that stand in such and such mathematical causal relations. I mean, I don't think it's at least not obvious why sensory capacities would be required to formulate thoughts like this. You might think sensory capacities are required to know these thoughts are true. I mean, there's a different issue about knowledge. To what extent, what could a pure thinker know? And maybe there are limitations on what it could know without perception. But here the issue is not what could it know, but what could it think? And it's much less clear there are objections to a pure thinker thinking that. What now, limitations, what couldn't a pure thinker think? I do think there are some serious limitations on what a pure thinker could think. Most obviously, pure thinkers seem plausibly to have certain strong lacunae when it comes to sensory concepts. Could a pure thinker who lacks vision, lacks any visual sensory capacities, have the concept of red? Could it master the concept of red? I mean, arguably, it could have the concept of red in the same way that, you know, a colorblind person could, or indeed a blind person could. But, you know, typically that's regarded as not fully possessing the concept of red. Colorblind people don't have a full mastery or understanding of redness. And likewise, you might think a being with no sensory capacities whatsoever would not fully possess the sensory concept of redness. Likewise for pain, likewise for loudness and other sensory concepts. Spatial concepts are a tricky case, but I think you can make the case that a being without any spatial senses does not fully understand the concept of space. They might have a structural understanding of it, just as Mary in the black and white room could have a structural understanding of redness. A being without sensory concepts could have a structural understanding of space. Maybe that's not a full understanding of space. There are issues about perceptual demonstratives like this and that. Lacking perception, it seems a pure thinker could not possess pure perceptual demonstratives. There are complex issues for singular concepts, concepts of a person like Beyonce, or a place like Montreal, lacking any causal connections to Beyonce or to Montreal. Could a pure thinker have the singular concept of Beyonce or Montreal? I mean, arguably, could have certain descriptive concepts that denote these individuals in philosophical parlance. You know, the person who is, you know, very rich and famous and has other properties, the place with people with such and such culture and location. And that would enable it to think a lot, but maybe a pure thinker would lack singular concepts. And likewise, maybe concepts of action, like practical knowledge. This is how to. Okay, so I'm certainly not arguing that pure thinkers can think everything that a human could think. There are lots of limitations of what a pure thinker can think, but at least now I'm stressing the glass half full aspect of this view. There are a lot of things that pure thinkers are possible, and there's quite a lot they could think, although there are limitations. There's a nice discussion of issues in this vicinity by the historian and philosopher Catherine Wilson in talking about Descartes' immortal souls. Descartes' immortal souls were pure thinkers, and Descartes kind of talked as if that was an attractive thing to be, and she talks about how miserable it would be to be an immortal soul without any sensory capacities. She thinks Descartes should have said, if our minds endure after death, they will feel neither pain nor pleasure, because they'll no longer be a composite with our bodies. We'll no longer see colors, touch objects, and hear sounds. We'll not remember events of our past lives. We'll be numb and inert. We'll be almost nothing, at most capable of imageless thought and intellectual memory. Okay, so Catherine Wilson is making the glass half empty case. Being a pure thinker without sensory capacities would be miserable, but still, even she doesn't deny that they can think quite a lot. So we at least get to you know, a significant range of thoughts that a pure thinker can think. Arguably, you might, in previous work, I've talked a lot about structuralism. You can make the case that pure thinkers will be largely structuralist thinkers who can form a logical or mathematical conception of non-mental reality. Interestingly, this is much like the view that contemporary philosophers of science take about the theoretical concepts of an awful lot of say, physical theories, that these are broadly structuralist theories. A pure thinker would be able to entertain structural hypotheses about the external world, like science, according to this view, structural realism. Again, the pure thinker is a bit like the case of a red-green colorblind person who lacks the sensory concept red, but still has a structural, mathematical, causal conception of redness. It's not fully possessing the concept, but still able to you know, think a lot of structural thoughts in the vicinity. Okay, so that's all a lot of stuff about the sense thought thesis in general without tying it specifically to AI. Upshot is that the unrestricted sense thought thesis is false. And that in principle, it looks like a system without sensory grounding could at least entertain a rich array of thoughts and build models of the world, perhaps limited ones in certain respects, but nonetheless, they could think quite a lot. They could even refer to individuals under descriptions, although maybe not via, for example, direct perceptual demonstration, and will certainly lack important sensory concepts and much empirical and practical knowledge. Okay, what about language models in particular? I mean, language models are not pure thinkers. Probably should have said that much earlier. Language models, at the very least, have inputs and outputs, which pure thinkers, at least the way I was thinking about pure thinkers, they don't really have inputs and outputs. Some would say they have senses. This comes down to the complex issue of whether their textual input and output counts as a sense. I want to say, well, yes, in the sense of being a connection to the environment. No, probably not in the sense of being analog or iconic, or not obviously accompanied by rich sensory experience. I think if you want to find like a thought experiment, I mean, I think the pure thinker case already makes a case that an AI system without any inputs and outputs could in principle think, but that's not the language model case. A language model is more like that kind of pure thinker, supplemented by certain linguistic abilities to process linguistic inputs and to produce linguistic outputs. Here maybe the relevant thought experiment of what I call a pure thinker, talker, understander. A pure thinker combined with the ability to understand linguistic inputs and to produce linguistic outputs. I call these just a pure talker for short, but really it's a pure thinker, talker, understander. And the question then is whether that is possible and what beings like that could think or understand. And again, I think just as I argued that pure thinkers are possible in principle, I'd argue these pure talkers are possible in principle. Being that could, I mean, I'm not directly claiming that language models are themselves pure thinker, talker, understanders at this point. But the question just is whether beings like this are possible. I would say, yeah, if pure thinkers are possible, pure talkers are very plausibly possible. Pure talkers can know many things by being told. I mean, there's a question about how pure talkers' linguistic inputs and outputs work. I guess I'm thinking of them as working roughly the way they work in something like a language model, rather than being produced by seeing a word or hearing a word. Is produced by somehow mainlining text, by getting some kind of digital input of words and their constituents directly. Maybe there are going to be versions of this where it works by telepathy, where you basically have the minimal amount of input and output required to process linguistic inputs and nothing more. No analog here of seeing a word or hearing a sound. I would argue that these pure talkers then can know many things about math, about science, about history by being told. They could even possess many concepts via a linguistic community. I mean, in virtue of these linguistic inputs and outputs, these systems really have a much richer grounding in their environment than pure thinkers do. Arguably, what happens when you acquire a concept like Beyonce? You hear some people talking about Beyonce maybe, and you start using the word yourself and gradually get inculcated into a practice of talking about Beyonce or Montreal. You might at some point see Beyonce, but you might not. Either way, it seems you acquire the concept. I would argue that these pure talkers could do something very similar via a language community. They could acquire a concept of Beyonce in Montreal that is somehow connected to the environment. And if they can do that, of course, the next thought is maybe a language model could do something like that too. I would say these systems still don't fully master sensory or bodily concepts. They lack sensory motor know-how, but I think nevertheless, they can plausibly think and understand quite a lot. So where does that get us where language models are concerned? Again, I've not argued directly that language models can think or understand. I haven't even argued directly that language models are these thinker, talker, understanders. If you like, that's an aspiration for language models. And one reason I haven't argued this directly is there's many other possible obstacles to language models thinking, understanding. Are they conscious? Maybe biology is required for thinking and understanding. Maybe their capacities are hopeless right now. They're mere stochastic parrots. they need to be a lot better at reasoning in order to think. There are a lot of objections I haven't even addressed. I've simply argued that their lack of sensory capacities or sensory capacities beyond language doesn't entail that they don't think or understand. If pure thinker-talker understanders are possible, that shows us that systems like language models that have merely have linguistic inputs and outputs can in fact think or talk or understand quite a lot. So the argument from lack of sensory capacities to absence of thinking and understanding doesn't go through. Just very briefly, to end with, let me just say something about an ancillary issue, which is maybe, you might think maybe sensing is not required for thinking, but nonetheless, sensory capacities can at least boost our capacities for thinking quite a lot. And there's actually an empirical version of this thesis, which is, to what extent does multimodality actually boost our capacities on, or boost capacities on cognitive tasks? So multimodal models, as we've seen, have quasi-sensory capacities for processing images, audio, bodies, and so on. Question: do these capacities enhance at least cognition? And here, in the case of language models, that'll be, does the ability to process multimodal inputs and outputs, does that enhance cognition, that is performance on pure language tasks? And interestingly, there seems to be an increasing body of evidence, empirical body of evidence, that the boost here is at least very small and possibly negligible in the limit. I mean, there's this fact that pure GPT-4, the pure language model, there's GPT-4 has a pure language model version and a with just text inputs, outputs, training, and a multimodal version that processes multimodal inputs and outputs. Interestingly, on various standardized tests in the text realm, pure GPT-4 is at least very close to multimodal GPT-4. At best, a very small boost. I know Ellie Pavlik is visiting this seminar next week. She's got a lot of work also tending to suggest that multimodality gives you a surprisingly small boost. Language models and multimodal models tend to develop isomorphic representations of colors, space, and so on. That you can get a space of representation of color and space from a pure language model, which is very, very similar in kind to the representations you'll get from a multimodal model. You can go back and forth between them very easily. I mean, theoretically, there's also the point that sensory inputs can be trivially translated into text inputs. Instead of getting an image file, which is processing an image file, you can process a text file that says the first pixel is 1, the second pixel is 0, and so on. And a powerful enough language model will trivially be able to translate between, say, image format and text format. So you would expect that a powerful enough language model should be able to process both text and images equally, which does raise questions about, here I'll just kind of leave this as a question for discussion, but it starts to look as though even though pure empirically, in the actual case, even though pure language models lack sensory capacities, like capacities to process image files, audio files, and so on, that means they lack those sensory concepts we talked about. That means they lack the motor know-how that we talked about. Interestingly, this doesn't seem to impede their performance on cognitive tasks. I mean, in a way, they're like Frank Jackson's thought experiment of Mary in the black and white room, who doesn't experience redness and doesn't fully understand redness, but nonetheless, she can answer any question about redness about as well as someone with color vision can, because she knows the science forwards and backwards, and she's a super duper reasoner, and so on. And you might think, okay, that begins to suggest that maybe language models are at least a little like that, even though they lack sensory capacities, motor capacities, and so on. They have a theoretical understanding that is really surprisingly rich. You might have thought that a full-scale theoretical understanding of the world would turn on having sensory capacities, and that would boost you to somewhere where, in principle, you could not be without sensory capacities. But maybe the moral of all this is actually that sensory capacities are less crucial to cognition than we might have thought. So really, there's partly a kind of a philosophical case here based on this thought experiment of a pure thinker that you might think is kind of very abstract, but I think at least shows in principle the possibility of cognition without sensory capacities. I think that philosophical case, it can also be accompanied by a somewhat more empirical case, grounded in the examination of, say, language models and their capacities here, that actually tends to suggest that even where sensory motor capacities are present, they give you less of a boost on cognitive tasks in principle than you might have thought, and that an awful lot of cognition could in principle go on just in the world of text. I mean, language models are surprisingly powerful, and I think we ought to, take what we've learned from language models into account in our models of cognition. And I would have been initially inclined to a model of cognition where sensory motor capacities are very, very central, maybe even required for a rich cognitive understanding of the world. Now, based on thinking about these cases, I've at least come to wonder whether it turns out that sensory motor capacities are somewhat less essential than we previously thought. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. Usually what happens at this point is the minds of the listeners are a little bit timid and a little bit sluggish, but I see that some people already have their hands up. Those here in the room should come up to the microphone, and please keep your questions short. This is not a one-on-one discussion. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me correctly?
Yeah, who am I talking to?
Matthew Gravel. So I had a question based on the link between the first part and the second part of the presentation. When you were talking about...
Just a question. Can I see you anywhere? I'm looking for you on my screen.
Well,
are you inside of a camera?
No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Oh, okay.
Don't even look. Okay.
Let me explain to Dave and then we'll go on. Dave, there are some questions from Zoomland and some from Montreal.
Yeah.
This is a Montreal question.
And the Montreal questioners are not on camera?
No, they're not.
Okay, fine.
No, okay, we don't have time. Go ahead.
Anyway, I was wondering, when you were talking about the pure thinker, you pretty much tried to imply that the sensory motor was not needed, but when we talk briefly at the end about how LLM did not need sensory process to be able to get the same type of result as multimodal LLM and pure LLM, it seemed more like the details that we got from sensory capacity were pre-baked inside the knowledge base that the LLM got. So directly, I'm not sure whether it proves that you don't need it. It seems that we pretty much just force it inside every other type of condition we would get from it.
Sorry, the microphone was kind of cutting in and out there, so I'm not sure that I got absolutely everything. Your thought was that even in the language models I discussed towards the end, they do have some significant sensory capacities because of their text input.
You can say it, if you can say it briefly this time, clearly.
It just meant that it seemed like we pre-baked those sensory capacity inside the knowledge base when we trained it, since most of the language that was learned is based on corpus of people that use those sensory capacity to be able to learn in the first place.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So they at least have kind of derivative sensory knowledge. They've got not, because they're trained on texts of people talking about sensory things. So it's at least causally grounded in sensory discussion. Here, the issue, I guess, is not just the issue of whether there's a grounding in the environment, but whether actual sensory capacities are required. And if you don't count language models inputs as actual sensory capacities, then it looks like you can do an awful lot without actual sensory capacity. Now, you might try and put forward a weaker thesis, like some kind of causal connection to sensory inputs in the environment is required. Then yeah, I agree that language models and even pure thinker talkers don't refute that, because they are causally connected to sensory information in the environment. For that case, we might want to come back to the pure thinker case, where I'd make the case that they can think a lot in the absence of any causal grounding connections.
Okay, thank you. Per, go ahead. Please turn on your sound.
Is it me?
Hey, Per.
Hey, Dave. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks a lot. Incredibly interesting. I was wondering, if pure thinkers are possible, then there's some explanation of what makes it the case that they think about conjunction or their selves or the number two. And I guess you mentioned maybe the psychological role is what grounds this capacity then. I wonder if you have any more details of that, because it would seem to be very easy to replicate the psychological role, if that's a causal role, for example, of conjunction. That seems very simple. So it would seem that very many systems then think conjunction, unless there are some restrictions on this. Did I make sense?
Yeah. So there's an interest. Yeah. So if these pure thinkers can think, and they don't think in virtue of external connections to the world or even connections to senses, in virtue of what is it that they think? How do we do like psychosemantics for pure thinkers? And yeah, the place I'd definitely be most inclined to concentrate is on the psychological role. And you're saying, couldn't that be simple? Well, there's going to be a psychological role just for the attitude thinking, let's say, and also a psychological role for the relevant content. And I'm thinking that what it takes to think may actually be quite complex. Presumably what it takes to think, for example, is, even in the case of beings that do have sensory capacities, arguably vision can represent conjunction in systems that don't have thought, but it takes, it's much more demanding to be a thinker than to be a perceiver. And that's partly because in order to think, you've got to play a very complex psychological role. So I'd want to, and I don't have a full story about what it takes to think in the first place, but that's where I'd be inclined to look. Of course, the other place that some people might want to look is in conscious experience. Some people think that conscious experience plays a not necessarily even sensory experience, but for a pure thinker, it might be cognitive conscious experience that plays some crucial role in grounding thoughts about the world. And some philosophers who like phenomenal intentionality, like Angelo Mendelevici and others, have developed stories like that. And you might want to look at that, because that then raises the question, where does conscious experience come from? Where is that grounded? And you might then either come back to something more basic, or you'll say, no, conscious experience is itself basic. And I'm not fully opposed to giving conscious experience a fundamental role here, but that's a pure thinker could have relevant kinds of cognitive experience that might play some role, at least, in grounding its thoughts. But if you're inclined to a somewhat more reductionist direction, I'd think that rich psychological roles are the place to look.
Okay, thank you. And Anand Advani is the next question. Please turn on your.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the talk. That was a very nice talk. I had a question about your slide, what could a pure thinker think? And I remember you had included as the last bullet point, like some notion of semantics, and as part of that, the notion of truth. And I guess that wasn't obvious to me why you would argue that a pure thinker could have a notion of truth. Do you mean like the possibility that there could be things that are true, or that certain things could be true?
I don't know. I guess I was thinking that, for example, pure thinkers can make judgments. They can know about their own judgments, and they can, at least in principle, evaluate their judgments for being true. Like, I think a given thought, and I say, I will think, this is a temporal concept. I will think another thought in a moment. And then they find themselves thinking another thought in a moment, says, yeah, my previous thought was correct. There's a certain, or true. There's a certain psychological role for truth that it seems that they can have even in the absence of connections to the external world. I mean, it's maybe the worry is one specifically about the external world. Like, I think there's a being distinct from me, and I can't actually verify that. Could I still understand what it is for that to be true? I mean, I agree it's not totally obvious, but I think the most plausible accounts I've seen of the the role of the concept of truth don't seem to actually turn on having any connections to the environment. So I think there's a prima facie case there.
Okay, the next question is from Marc Brisbert from Belgium.
Yeah, hi. Glad to be here and to hear about everything. But I would like to come back to the first question, because I think you underestimated it to some extent, because I had exactly the same question. So to some extent, we humans have developed language as a kind of a substitute for reality, a more agile even code than reality, sensory coding. So to some extent, your pure thinker, if I understand you correct, is somebody who has been fed with all the knowledge that humans kind of gathered and put in a certain code. So the real question is whether your pure thinker could have emerged, could have grown without this sensory grounding. So maybe now we are in a situation where a pure thinker can kind of exist because it is given a code and it is given basic knowledge how to work with the code.
Yeah, so there's two different cases here: the pure thinker or the pure thinker, talker, understander. Are you concerned more with one or the other?
I mean, both of them kind of only function once they have a code to think.
Yeah.
So where does the code come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so for the pure thinker, talker, understander, I mean, one thing, the pure thinker will not know very much about the world because they have no sensory inputs. Maybe about the world, what it can figure out a priori, but not much more than that. I've argued it could
will it know anything?
Yeah.
Will it know anything? Will any code come up?
Maybe it can know about its own mind, and there are questions about how much we want to allow the pure thinker to have. Maybe it could at least speculate about the character of its world.
Yeah, but how do you know?
It won't have rich sensory. It won't have rich sensory knowledge.
I mean, there is nothing. There is no language. There is no code to start from. What you are saying here is that actually, if you give it a complete code, then it can think on its own.
Or if you give, I think we really need to separate. We really need to separate the issues of thinking and of knowledge. I agree it wouldn't know very much about the world, but I've argued it could at least formulate hypotheses about the world, think about the world in a way that's at least fairly.
It needs a code.
Fairly rich.
And where does the code come from? Even it needs a 1 and a 0 as a minimum. Where does it come from?
Where does that come from? That's a basic capacity for these systems. For any system. I'm not trying to be a pure empiricist here. It says you can learn absolutely everything. There are some basic capacities built into any of these systems. Yeah. But I agree that the pure thinker, talker, understander, the one that knows a lot, is piggybacking on a lot of text, which was itself the product of sensory knowledge and sensory understanding by the people who produced that text. So I certainly wouldn't want to use. So you got to be careful about what you're using these different examples to argue. I certainly wouldn't use the pure thinker, talker, understander to argue that, for example, against any grounding requirement in the environment, or even. But I think but the pure thinker case does, I think, at least I would argue, make at least a plausible case. You can think a lot without that kind of sensory base. Maybe you can think more once you have it.
Yeah. I just think, like the first speaker did, that you kind of take too much for granted that there is a code or that there can be a code without any kind of.
So it's really the code. I thought the issue for you and the previous speaker was the body of training input of people discussing things like color and space and so on. But now it's a slightly different issue, the issue which is you need a code, you need an algorithm, and so on. All that's running. And yeah, I'm certainly not arguing for some kind of extreme blank slate view. Yeah, that's no part of my thesis.
Okay,
So I'm happy to
thanks.
assume that there's some basic cognitive architecture in place.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I feel somewhat more sympathy with the questions from the non-philosophers as well. Not that I have more sympathy for non-philosophers than philosophers, but over here, they seem to come closer to something substantive that you're saying. And you're not answering. I agree with them that you're not answering. When they talk about
give me the question that I'm not answering, and I'll try and answer
it. Let me put it another way. I'll give you a question. Are you, well, I'll give you two questions. The second question will be, what do you mean by thinking? But let me put that aside. Are you a computationalist? And a computationalist believes that thinking is computation, which means it's symbol manipulation following algorithms. Are you a computationalist? And if not, what do you think thinking is?
I mean, I wasn't trying to set out any positive view of thinking in this talk. I was just trying to talk about whether sensory grounding is a requirement. But if you want to ask about my positive views, I'm not a full computationalist about thinking, although I do think computation plays a very important role. I think consciousness plays an important role in thinking as well. And I'm not a computationalist about consciousness. I mean, I do think there are connections between computation and consciousness, but whether it's computation, so I think computation plus thought is made up from computation plus consciousness, but I don't think computation requires sensory grounding. I don't think the relevant computation requires sensory grounding. I also don't think the relevant consciousness requires sensory grounding.
Well, there's a third thing here called, which you mentioned, the symbol grounding problem. Computation is the manipulation of symbols, and grounding means that the symbols get meaning. If you don't ground them, then you still have symbol manipulation. Maybe that's all you mean by thinking, but in that case, you are a computationalist.
I think the relevant, I mean, meaning has to come from somewhere, to be sure. The question is, does it have to come from sensory connections to the environment? I think it comes from, I think at least in plenty of cases, say the mathematical case, I think, you know, when we think about 2 + 2 is 4, we think about 2 and 4, not in virtue of any sensory connections to, you know, numerical aspects of the environment, but in virtue of its internal psychological role. There's a distinctive psychological role for addition, for numbers, and so on. So if you like, that's still a kind of grounding. It's just not environmental or sensory grounding. I mean,
their grounding is beginning to become figurative, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the basic question here now is the issue which Per was arising. In virtue of what do our thoughts have their meaning or have their content? And I'm a pluralist here. I think for some concepts, it's something external, as with, say, a singular concept of a person you're perceptually demonstrating. But a lot of the time, it's something internal. And let me turn it back on you. Do you think that the content of, say, logical and mathematical concepts essentially turns on some connection to the environment?
No, absolutely not. I think it's pure syntax. I think Turing is right with his Church-Turing thesis, weak Church-Turing thesis, that what mathematicians are doing when they're doing mathematics is computation, manipulation of symbols. And I have to add, mathematics does not have a symbol grounding problem. English does, and thinking does, but mathematics doesn't.
Thinking about mathematics has a symbol grounding problem.
Yes.
Why is this a thought about addition and not a thought about subtraction, for example?
It has nothing to do, when you're doing calculations, whatever, when you're manipulating symbols, you don't have a symbol grounding problem because you don't have to mean anything.
Mathematical symbols mean something, and when we think about mathematics, we mean something.
To you and to me, but an algorithm is an algorithm. It simply says, if squiggle, put out squoggle.
But the symbol grounding problem still arises. You can describe, say, my mathematical cognition in terms of squiggles and squoggles, but my mathematical cognition is actually about numbers in virtue, or about addition. How does it get to be about addition rather than subtraction? That's a mathematical symbol grounding problem.
Turing's notion is not a notion about mathematical thinking. It's a notion about mathematics. What are mathematicians doing when they're doing mathematics, when they're doing computation in mathematics? And that.
What do you think about the Cogito case?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
What do you think about the case? I think, therefore I am. Do you think that turns essentially on connections to the environment?
No, it's all right for you to bring that up, but I think the only reason Descartes was right that you could answer that with certainty was because you have a sort of a mild view on it. I have a stronger view on it, that you have to feel in order to know that you're thinking. It feels like something to think, and that's why you can't be wrong about it, because when you're feeling it, you're feeling that.
It doesn't have to be sensory feelings, though, right? Or it doesn't have to involve any sensory connection to the environment?
Feeling is something that my brain is doing. It feels like something to feel. I don't know of any non-biological notion of feeling unless you want to say that ChatGPT is feeling, and ChatGPT doesn't think so.
I think in general, thinking has a certain phenomenology. It feels like something, in a broad sense, it feels like something to think. But that's not a sensory phenomenology, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's got nothing to, it need have nothing to do with vision or hearing. I mean, sometimes you hear words go through your, but I don't think that is essential to thinking. I think the experience of thinking may be central to thinking. To that extent, I would agree to you that thinking requires feeling in this broad sense. But that's not, this broad sense of feeling is more like experiencing, consciously experiencing, which is, in my view, consciousness is far broader than just sensation and perception.
I think consciousness and experience are weasel words if you don't settle on what it is that you mean by the content. Phenomenology is another weasel word. Feeling is clear. It feels like something to feel hot. It feels like something to feel tired, and it feels like something to to believe that 2 and 2 is 4 and not 5.
I don't agree that the word feeling is clear. It's very ambiguous. The standard meaning of the word feeling for many people is tied to, maybe tied to emotions and to the body. So does vision feel like something? I mean, I agree there's a broad sense of feeling where you say yes, but most people would say that's not, the word feeling is not apt for what it's like to see. That said, I agree with you. There's a broad sense of the word experience where we can say vision feels like something, thinking feels like something, but I would just insist that broad sense of experience does not turn on sensory motor capacities specifically, and does not turn on connections to the environment.
I'm going to pass it over to Steve Hansen just to close that it's somewhat gratifying to know that we're as far apart, at least as far apart now as we were when you were a graduate student.
Yeah, I'm sure we could find some things to agree on if we tried.
Steve, go ahead.
Oh, on that positive note, my goodness. I really enjoyed your talk. It was thoughtful and charming in some ways, but there's things about it that I don't understand, probably because I'm not.
Raise your volume a little bit, Steve. Please. Steve, raise your volume a little bit.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, raise it a little bit. Barely.
Oh, sure. How about there?
Better.
Better?
Yep. Better.
Yeah? Better.
Yes, go ahead.
I have a fancy mic and it's probably defeating me somehow. So the distinctions, so let's go back to the GPT here. And of course, the normalization of this has been astounding since a year ago. That is, there seem to be people who think they understand what's going on. And from my understanding of people at OpenAI and people like Hinton, who should probably actually know, we don't understand anything that's going on here. So I appreciate your light touch here in terms of thinker, talkers, understanders, although sometimes that's all I think I am, is a thinker, talker, understander. But I don't understand the distinctions relative to GPT. Now, keep in mind, GPT is an incredibly stupid system. It predicts the next word. It has 4,000 attention weights that get adjusted by gradient descent. And then it's trained on 1 billion or so tokens, and it has 600 billion connections. Probably GPT-5 will have 1 trillion. Early reports seem to be that the size of this thing is diminishing returns. also the interest in it is dropping dramatically from our millennial friends and Gen Zers. So there's something interesting about it as it gets branded as a thing and people think they know it. And I appreciated your concern about what it is and what it's doing, and this distinction between thinker and talker, or pure thinker and talker, is confusing. So one of the early connectionist kinds of debates that started up about a year ago when this first started, people were concerned about consciousness. And I believe you have some thoughts about that are important. So I'm curious, one of the things Jeff Hinton asked in this little tiny debate, and then he disappeared, was, couldn't this thing have a little bit of consciousness? And everyone said, yes, or no, or I don't know. And there's something about, so let's suppose this is like a kind of a very large phase transition where you have, trillions of connections, and they actually at some point organize. There's some kind of internal structure. In fact, I think there's no question. There is an internal structure. I've seen the insides of some of these systems. They have 50 to 100 million cluster contexts. But the question of the control structure, like an executive structure, is really not clear here. And yet we're all treating it as though it is clear. And it's concerning to me. And sort of when philosophers talk about it as some kind of standard thing, it's even more concerning. So I guess I'm still shocked every day, every time I ask, GPT about something, a raid card or a poem or something, and it knows stuff. It's also linguistically fluid, which is strange. Predicting one word ahead, even if you're 2 years old, probably isn't going to make you linguistically fluid. So this has nothing to do with biology. It has nothing to do with sort of human computation structures in the brain. I do a lot of brain imaging. I'm certainly looking for the source of consciousness, and that's an interesting one. But what's this distinction between talker and thinker, and what does it have to do with GPTs?
Yeah, not much that I said was very specific to the GPT systems, but I agree that they are both extremely stupid and extraordinarily sophisticated at the same time. And, no one predicted, as far as I know, that systems that were merely trained on predicting the next word would end up having these remarkable, far more general capacities that at least we would have thought applied some kind of sophisticated cognition. And it's amazing. And yeah, look, they have all kinds of limitations too still, but it's just extraordinary what they can do given that incredibly limited basis. That said, I'm not questions about where they actually, they are extremely different from human thinkers in many ways. Their basic architecture, as far as I can tell, nothing like human cognitive architecture. And yeah, the absence of senses is just the beginning in a pure language model. In the article I wrote on consciousness, I addressed some of these issues, just somewhat more specific to language models, in a bit more depth. I talked, for example, about the fact that transformers are basically almost entirely feed-forward systems, and there's a pretty strong case that consciousness requires some recurrent processing, in which case that's a very important architectural limitation.
Well, just to have a small justice, there is a recurrent structure in the 4,000 attentional weights. What they do is they create a covariant structure, and the covariance itself has some limited recurrence. But you're right. I mean, we're still talking, maybe 160,000 cells. It's still extremely, if we consider what short-term memory is in a human, it's not that. And the computational people seem to think that short-term memory. It's not short-term memory. I mean, psychologists will quickly point this out.
Yeah. Some very local recurrence in the attentional structure. There's also some more global recurrence coming from the fact that outputs are recirculated, but at least it's very limited recurrent. One can talk about the absence of something like a global workspace in these models. Yoshua Bengio has tried to develop language models that possess a kind of global workspace, but that's also a limitation. Maybe the best way to think about it, though, is I'm not really making any claims in this paper about current language models. Just claims about what a language model could do in principle, and what a model with sensory capacities could do in principle. And I'm trying to argue that, in particular, the absence of sensory capacities in a pure language model is not on its own something that disqualifies it from thinking. There may be all kinds of other more specific features of current language models that do. And yeah, look, it's an interesting question in its own right. Do current language models have a speck of consciousness? I think it was Ilya Sutskever who said that. Jeff Hinton, as far as I know, is a skeptic about that, about consciousness.
Well, yeah, no, I've talked to him in recent times, and yes, he's besides his doomsday sort of tour, where he said we were all doomed and civilization will end soon. I think he's getting out in front of whatever Microsoft, probably bad players are, that will, introduce various kinds of robotic systems that will, end up hurting someone in a healthcare situation. But I think the consciousness stuff here, relative to this tipping point, which is, I think, a large, prevalent belief now of a bunch of the people studying this, is there was some point where it flipped and something happened, something grew. Has to be a control system, but nobody has identified, because you're looking at billions and billions of weights. It's almost as bad as looking at the brain. And so it's not clear we're going to make this, any progress, since we're not making much progress with brain structures.
I don't know, maybe we're finding there are routes to intelligence quite distinct from the way that the brain gets there. I mean, if you ask me down the current language model, is it intelligent? Of course, it depends on what you mean by thinking intelligence. One thing to keep in mind where consciousness is concerned is that most people think even some very simple systems are conscious. To be conscious, you don't have to be human. A lot of people these days think fish, maybe even insects, are conscious. So there's a spectrum of consciousness. I'd also argue there's a spectrum of thinking, and I'm not entirely opposed to the idea that current language models could fall somewhere on that spectrum that's above the 0 point. But that would take a lot of work.
Okay. At this ecumenical point, I want to thank you. We've run out of time. I want to thank you very much. I want to do a qualifier to the fact that even if we're as far apart as we were when you were a graduate student, I've always been in favor of disagreement. So I like it that way. Thank you very much.
Okay, I certainly agree with that.
Thank you very much for coming to Montreal for the second time to give the same talk. This time virtually. Were you there in the flesh the first time?
Yeah. The American Philosophical Association was held in Montreal in early January. It was cold, but it was a pleasure to be there. What a great city.
Well, it was a pleasure to have you here again, and thank you very much, and thank everybody for coming.
Thanks. If anyone has